Morning, folks. Can you hear me? Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here in this amazing city. I'm not a businessman or a sales guy. My background is physics and engineering. I like gathering and analyzing data to solve important problems. I think the most important problem in our times is how to keep build and maintain a successful organization. And in the process of building and developing organizations, the factor that's the most crucial is, I think, leadership. So I'm a fanatic on the subject of leadership. That's all I ever think about. And I think in general that our understanding of leadership these days is substantially flawed. So what I want to talk about, that's what I want to talk about today. That is to say, the objectives of this talk. I want to talk about the relationship between leadership and organizational effectiveness, and how humility and charisma interact with the topics of leadership and organizational effectiveness. So the goal is to define charisma and define humility, and then I'm going to argue that charisma, which everyone thinks is the absolute essential characteristic of a leader, I want to propose that charisma is related to narcissism. I want to suggest that charismatic leaders can be, narcissistic leaders can be destructive, that humble leaders can be effective, and I want to distinguish between emergence and effectiveness, so that charisma is what characterizes leader emergence, and humility is what characterizes leader effectiveness. So that's basically the talk, and we can all leave now. So, charisma is a compelling attractiveness that can inspire devotion in other people. It's stage presence. It's something like animal magnetism. The notion is that charismatic people can somehow, by the sheer force of their personality, compel you to honor and respect and obey them. In contrast, humility is defined as a freedom from pride, from arrogance, the quality of low self-preoccupation. Humble people are able to get over themselves. Charisma, and in leadership samples, charisma and narcissism correlate about 0.5. There's a very substantial correlation between rated charisma and assessed narcissism. Charismatic narcissists, people who are high on both charisma and narcissism, won't accept responsibilities for their failures. If things go wrong, it was your fault. If things go right, it was because they were great. They take more credit for success than is fair. They won't listen to feedback. They're unable to learn from experience, and that's a problem because 50% of all decisions in business are wrong. Decision-making in business, there's never enough time, there's never enough information, things change. So 50%, the data indicate half of all business decisions are wrong. So good judgment cannot involve getting things right, because in principle you're going to be wrong half the time. So good judgment has to do with being able to admit when you were wrong and then reverse the process. So that's the problem with narcissists. They won't listen to feedback and they can't learn from experience. They won't believe it when you tell them that their decision was wrong. They feel entitled to leadership positions. Of course I'm in charge here. This is what I was born for. And they ruin companies. And the way they ruin companies is not by being narcissists. They ruin companies by making bad decisions and then being unwilling to admit that the decision was bad and to reverse themselves. So, where do charismatic CEOs come from? Before the 1970s, CEOs were just like caretakers, and the average CEO salary was only 3 or 4 times that of the rest of the workforce. But in the 1970s, activist investments like Carl Icahn and T. Rowe Pickens began pushing, because they had invested in the companies, they began pushing the companies to generate better results so that their investments would pay off better. This, on the one hand, led to agency theory, which is the notion that you tie a CEO's performance to the salary, compensation to the performance of the stock. And that, in turn, led people to think that what they needed for a CEO was charisma, or what they, and the thing is that, so, as he says, companies began hiring CEOs who guaranteed better. One of the characteristics is basically an item. The one-item test for a narcissist is someone who says, I can take this company to the next level. I can get this company moving again. I can make America great again. When you hear that, you know you're talking to a narcissist. So organizations think they need charismatic leadership, but charisma often brings narcissism along the way. So there you go. Well, the thing is that charismatic people have a stage presence, and people think that stage presence is what defines leadership. It is impressive appearance out in front. They're one of the greatest generals in the history of warfare. Is a fellow named Ulysses S. Grant. He was a two-time president of the United States. He had zero charisma. When he walked up in front, and when he took over the U.S. Army during the American Civil War, when he stepped up in front of the troops all said, "Who is this guy? Who's this small, kind of lumpy-looking guy, not very well dressed, utterly uncharismatic, just turned out to be one of the 4 greatest generals of all time." So there we go. Charisma, it permeates, the cult of charisma permeates business. So the job website, Indeed.com, lists 224,000 plus jobs that require charisma in order to satisfactorily perform, whereas only lists 3,340 jobs where humility might be a useful attribute. So by definition, it's just part of everyday thought now. It's part of the water supply. People think leaders need to be charismatic. Here's an example of the consequences. Oops, sorry. Here are 2 guys, both who rose to the top of their country's political hierarchy based on their charisma. That is to say, charisma does work. It can get you to the top. Both were self-serving narcissists. Both enjoyed limited but dedicated success. That is to say, their success wasn't all that great, but their followers were really serious followers, and they both created mixed legacies for themselves. Using the past tense, I hope I can get away with that. Here are 2 guys they both rose to the top of their country's political hierarchies based on their performance, not on their charisma. Both were dedicated to serving their country, not promoting their own careers. Both men were quite humble, were notably humble, and were widely admired, even adored by their subordinates. These are 2 of the greatest military leaders in the history of the world. The first is Nelson, Admiral Lord High, hero of the Battle of Trafalgar, who defeated Napoleon's fleet and saved England. And the second is the guy who won the American Civil War, which is the greatest war of the 19th century. During the American Civil War, all the European powers, the Germans, the French, the Russians, the Spanish, and the Brits, were all just on the periphery watching this fight. They thought that when the war was over, when the American Civil War was over, America would be exhausted and they could come back and resume their... No, they really had that in mind. And Grant says in his biography, at the end of the war, my army was the deadliest fighting force on earth, and the Europeans were not coming back. So these are 2, anyway, so this is just an example that there are great men who have also been humble. Here we go in business. The guy on the left, that's Neutron. His staff called him Neutron Jack. His name is Jack Welch. They said wherever he stepped, no grass would ever grow again. He was quite famous as he said, his line was, all of management is about self-confidence. He took over as CEO of GE. He ruined GE. It took a good long time for people to figure out how he leveraged GE Financial and paid no attention to the core business. He just played financial tricks, made himself a whole bunch of money, and then left a mess for everyone else to clean up. The second guy is a fellow named Darwin Smith. You've never heard of him. He was the CEO of Kimberly-Clark. When he took over Kimberly-Clark, it was a very modest and kind of staggering operation. By the time he left, it was one of the 4 best companies in the United States. It made vast fortune for 15 years of really, really successful performance. So most people have heard of Jack Welch, who ruined GE. Very few of you have ever heard of Darwin Smith, who saved and really, he turned Kimberly-Clark, it was a lumber company, basically wood products, and he turned it into paper products, Kleenex, diapers, and so forth, and did just a terrific job, but no one's ever heard of him. Who are the high-profile people in organizations? They're easy to recognize because their faces are in the annual report. They're leading charges and running programs and running meetings. So it's easy to identify the high-profile people in organizations, but what's the relationship between being a high-profile person in the organization and being an effective leader? This brings up the distinction that really needs to be hammered on, the distinction between emergence and effectiveness. And that brings up a book by a fellow named Fred Luthans. a book that most people have never heard of. It's really important. It's one of the 3 or 4 most important pieces of management or leadership research ever. He studied 457 managers, so it's a big sample as this kind of research goes. He studied 457 managers from a variety of organizations, and he studied each manager for over 4 years. He had a vast amount of data on each manager. Assessment results, biographical data, behavior recording samples where he walked around and followed them all day long, watching what they were doing. And then he gathered performance data at the end of the study. So 457 managers followed over 4 years, performance data at the end. And he concluded there were 2 ways to define the performance of these managers. The first way would be to define performance in terms of how fast do they get promoted and how much money do they make. So promotions and salary increases is one index of performance. And then the second index of performance was how well is their unit actually performing. You got this? So on the one hand, you got people who are rising rapidly and getting big pay raises, and on the other hand, you got people whose operations are performing at a very high level. And what he found was that there was only a 10% overlap in those 2 groups. That's a correlation of about 0.3. Those who advanced rapidly, and then what he had all this data on how they actually spent their time during the day. The guys who advanced rapidly and got the big pay raises spent their time networking. They spent their time doing politics. The guys whose teams were performing at a very high level spent their time working, coaching, operating, working, and providing feedback to their teams. So so the first group, the people with the rapid promotions and the rapid pay raises, we call those emergent because they stand out. And the second group, the people whose units were actually performing well, we call those effective. Now think about the definition of leadership. Organizations typically define leadership in terms of the people at the top. Well, those are the high emergent guys. Leadership is actually all about building and maintaining a high performance. Leadership is about beating the competition. Leadership's not about being at the top here. It's about winning. And so organizations routinely confuse emergence, which is standing out, with effectiveness, which is actually doing the job that you're paid for. So leadership research focuses on the top players, the C-suite, and assumes that they are by definition effective. But they are effective politicians. Whether or not they're effective leaders is another question. Leadership research should focus on effective leaders, not high-profile attention gatherers. So this book by Collins is another landmark piece of research. It's a really good piece of research. I don't think he ever understood what he'd done here. He studied the Fortune 1000 companies, looking for companies that had 15 years of performance significantly below the standard of their industry, and then there was a transition or a change, and then there was 15 years of sustained performance significantly above the standard for their industry, and then he found 11 companies that fit that profile. He said, what's the question? What is it that it determines the difference? How are these groups moving ahead and the others standing back? And he found that it was the CEOs. Companies with superior performance had the CEOs of the high-performing companies were humble but ferociously ambitious. He said when you walked in the room, you could not tell who the CEO was because they were so understated, they were so humble. But they were enormously effective and built very powerful organizations. So said me, back when I read this the first time about 20 years ago, I said, this is the work that tells you, say goodbye to the myth of charismatic leadership. Really interesting study from the MIT Leadership Institute directly supports this. MIT graduates have started 30,200 businesses with 4.6 million employees and a $1.9 trillion in annual revenues. The annual revenues of this MIT group are behind Russia but ahead of India. So these guys, this is a really powerful group of businessmen. And they all share the same leadership style, which they learned in school. Problem-focused as opposed to self-promotion, technically competent, understanding the nature of the business itself in detail, open-minded, open to new ideas, feedback. Humble people are open to feedback. Narcissists are not open to feedback. Data-driven, apolitical, collaborative, work with other people as opposed to self-promote, and avoiding the trappings of leadership. None of the corner office, just guys were out sitting with the troops. Bloomberg, when he was mayor of New York, when he was running Bloomberg, when he was running in New York, he sat in the middle of the room with his troops. There's no charisma, no arrogance, And well-known exemplars of this phenomenon are Sergio Marchionne, who saved Fiat and then saved Chrysler. He died about 6 months ago of overwork. But he fixed Fiat, and then he fixed Chrysler. He made him profitable. Herbert Joly, he took over at Best Buy about 2 years ago. It took him about 6 months. Best Buy was almost bankrupt. It's now a highly productive company. Alan Mulally, he was the number 2 guy at Boeing. Ford Motor Company was failing, was right on the verge of bankruptcy. He realized he was never going to be number 1 at Boeing, so he moved to Ford. He fixed Ford. He saved Ford. He turned it completely around. When he finally retired, they were quite profitable. His successor had 4 years of coattailing on Mullally's performance. Now we're into the 3rd CEO at Ford, and it's failing again. The new guy at GE is a fellow named Larry Culp, same style. My prediction is that he will fix GE if he's ever able to. But they're all the same kind of guys, just hardworking, serious, and humble, and well, it's just what I say here. So there are 6 characteristics, says Moi, of effective leaders. First thing people want to see in leaders is integrity. Can they be trusted? Do they keep their word? Do they self-deal? Do they play favorites? You want integrity. Second thing you want to see is competence. Do they actually know what they're talking about? Do they understand the business? The third thing you want is good judgment. That is to say, can they recognize when they made a mistake and then revise the mistake? And that requires humility. And then finally, and the fourth thing you want to see is vision. Do they understand where the company's going, and can they articulate that? Then you want humility, absolutely humility, which is what we've been describing. And then finally, a fierce desire to win. So, quiet self-confidence, ambitious and competitive, driven to improve the performance. Narcissists don't think they have anything to prove. They just assume that they're great, and you can feel it. Humble people think they have something to prove, and they work hard to do it. And then real competence in their chosen discipline. This is something that no one talks about these days. It has to do with what they call the cult of the MBA. The notion is with the MBAs, which started in the 1970s, that an MBA understands formal characteristics of business performance. And because there are these formal principles, they don't have to know what's going on at the level of the shop floor, because they understand the bigger picture. And it turns out that that's just wrong. Good leaders understand what the business is doing at the level of the shop floor. So here's a nice little paper that was published last year. We do personality assessment for a living. We have an inventory. It's called the Hogan Development Survey. It assesses what we call the dark side of personality. Bright side is how people appear when they're trying hard to make a good impression. The dark side is how they appear when they let down their guard. It's how they appear when they're dealing with their subordinates. And these are the 11 dimensions of the dark side. We have a group that we call the charisma. This is how we define charisma. It's in terms of this charisma cluster of the scales called bold. Bold means narcissism. Mischievous means psychopathy. Colorful means histrionic tendencies. These are all psychiatric terms. And then imaginative means schizotypal. So people with high scores on bold, mischievous, colorful, and imaginative are described as charismatic. And they are. They're really charming. They're interesting. They're fun. They're bright. And they make a great first impression. So my only point here, this is how we define charisma. Now, what are the consequences of charisma? Well, so people with high scores on bold are socially poised, arrogant, and entitled. That would be Donald Trump. People with high scores on mischievous are charming, manipulative, and impulsive. That would be Jeff Skilling, the disgraced CEO of Enron, who, when he was at Harvard Business School, his classmates described him as a psychopath. Colorful, smart, interesting, and self-dramatizing. That would be Bill Clinton. And then imaginative. These are people who are creative, impractical, eccentric, really interesting and colorful. That would be Elon Musk of Tesla. So these guys, you can see them in the headlines every day. Here we have next. So the vertical axis, the y-axis is overall effectiveness, ratings of overall effect. How competent are you at your job? And across the bottom is there scores for charisma on the HDS charisma culture. And what you see is that for self-ratings, the solid line is self-ratings. For people with high scores, there's a perfect linear relationship between self-ratings of effectiveness and increasing scores on the charisma culture. So the higher the charisma, the higher the scores on charisma, the more people are likely to, in a perfectly linear way, the more they're likely to describe themselves as highly effective. The dotted line is subordinates ratings of charisma. And what that shows is that people with low scores on charisma, their subordinates rate them as ineffective. People with moderate scores on charisma, the subordinates rate them as highly effective, and then once they pass a certain point, 70th percentile or so, the higher the scores on charisma, the lower the staff rates them for effectiveness. Do you all understand? It's a pretty simple graph. Do you all get it? Yeah. I didn't mean to say you were simple-minded. The lights are, I'm not getting any feedback from the audience. That's the reason I asked the question. It's like watching a 747 take off in your face. Humble individuals are willing to admit their limitations and mistakes. Humble individuals will spotlight other people's contributions and pay attention to their contributions. Listen to and learn from other people, ask them for their opinion, ask them for feedback. Make fun of themselves. Have you ever heard Donald Trump make fun of himself? They don't feel entitled. They feel they have something to prove. They have to demonstrate their worthiness or their effectiveness. And they have egalitarian values. They don't believe in big differences in status. And what do? What do humble leaders do? They focus on the performance of the team, not on their own personal success. They channel their ambition back into the organization and the performance of the organization, not their own personal gain. They create a culture of development by encouraging learning and personal development because they want other people to succeed because they understand if other people succeed, the whole operation does better. They build a culture of openness, trust, and recognition. Everybody can talk, everybody can feedback, everybody can participate. So we do personality assessment for a living, so we do scale construction, applied psychometrics. We've developed a measure of humility. We've been working on this for the last year and a half. It predicts job performance, that's enroll performance. It predicts in a positive way ratings for organizational citizenship. It predicts in negative way counterproductive work behaviors. Higher score on humility, the lower your scores for counterproductive behavior. The effective well-being of the staff, that is staff engagement. Higher the scores on humility, the higher the level of staff engagement. Job satisfaction of the staff, higher humility, the more job satisfaction. Engagement and turnover intentions go down with humble leadership. So the scale predicts all the sorts of things that you want it to predict, and it looks pretty good. This is a study of an actual real-world study of the consequences of CEO humility. So if this individual differences in CEO humility, low to high, the higher the CEO humility, the less discrepancy in the pay structure of the top management. That is to say, the top management team, all their salaries are all more in line with one another. The lower the CEO humility, the more discrepancy in the top management salaries. The higher the CEO humility, the more the top management team works together. The lower CEO humility, the more fractious and disputatious the top management team. The higher the CEO humility, you get ambidextrous. That is, they're able to change the strategy on the fly because they understand they made a mistake, as opposed to saying, this is what we're going to do, we'll keep going forever. And overall, better performance from the company. Higher the CEO, the better all these. And that's, it just, CEO creates staff, the good leadership creates staff engagement drives company performance, and that's the mechanism. So, to developing humility, if you feel you might need to do that, you need to spend time actively recognizing other people's contributions. You need actively work to understand your own limitations, particularly around decision making. Be willing to acknowledge your mistakes, particularly that you've made a bad decision. Ask others for feedback and understand that your way is not the only way. It's okay to get feedback from other people. Work to earn the respect of your colleagues. Don't assume that you're entitled to it. And monitor, keep under control your own self-promoting behaviors. Boink. So, final thoughts. Charismatic leaders focus on themselves. Humble leaders focus out there. Peter Drucker talked about the window, mirror and window analogy. He said, if things go wrong, look in the, for you, if you as a leader, if things go wrong, look in the mirror. If things are going well, look at your staff. Charisma destroys engagement. Humility creates engagement. Organizations that value charisma often overlook their most effective leaders because they're not out there. The effective people are out there doing their job. They're not playing politics and hanging out at the water cooler. So that your next generation of effective leaders may be hidden in plain sight. Let me see if this will work. This is the end of a Dirty Harry movie. Dirty Harry has been bullied by a narcissist the entire movie, and the narcissist has just gotten in a car, and he's coming up to tell his narcissistic boss something about the car. He tried to tell him.
Man's got to know his limitations.
Man's got to know his limitations. That's humility. Oh, and up next, so thank you for your attention.